Jaden Lancaster sat at his desk, typing furiously, perfecting a report that could save the company millions. His fingers flew over the keyboard, his mind racing with numbers, strategies, and solutions. He had spent weeks working on this, double-checking every detail, making sure there were no flaws. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from sheer determination. He was an intern, the lowest on the food chain, but he knew his worth. Across the room, Mr. Carter sat behind his massive oak desk, eyes locked on Jaden. He wasn't impressed. He wasn't even curious. He was waiting. Mr. Carter was a man who thrived on power, who enjoyed the feeling of control. He didn't like when someone outshined him, especially not an intern. Especially not this intern. Jaden worked harder than anyone in that office, and Mr. Carter hated it. He saw something in Jaden that made his stomach twist. Potential. And potential was dangerous. The next morning, Jaden stood in the glass-walled boardroom, surrounded by high-level executives. The city skyline stretched behind him, towering skyscrapers casting long shadows across the room. He took a deep breath. This was his moment. He clicked the remote, and the large screen behind him lit up. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and confident. "This strategy could increase our revenue by 40% in the next quarter." The data speaks for itself. Charts and graphs appeared, filled with numbers that told a story of profit, growth, and success. The room was silent. Then, murmurs. Executives leaned forward, whispering to each other. A few nodded in agreement. One even scribbled notes. Jaden's heart pounded. He had them. They were listening. Then, clapping. Slow, mocking. Mr. Carter stood up, smirking, his palms meeting in exaggerated applause. "Oh wow, an intern thinks he's a genius," he sneered. "Tell me, Jaden, do you think you deserve to be here?" The room fell deathly silent. Jaden's chest tightened. He could feel every eye on him, waiting to see how he would respond. But he refused to show weakness. I worked hard on this," he said firmly, standing his ground. Mr. Carter chuckled. A dark, condescending sound. Hard work. He picked up the printed report Jaden had prepared, flipping through the pages as if it were meaningless. Then, rip. He tore the report in half. Gasps echoed through the room. The paper fluttered to the floor like dead leaves. Jaden's throat tightened. He felt like someone had punched him in the gut. Weeks of effort, destroyed in seconds. Mr. Carter's eyes gleamed. "Pack your things. You're fired." The words hit like a hammer. Jaden froze. For a split second, his mind screamed at him to fight back, to prove Carter wrong, to demand justice. But he didn't. He just stood there, staring. The silence was suffocating. No one spoke. No one dared to challenge Mr. Carter. The executives looked away, suddenly interested in their coffee cups, their notepads, their fingernails. Cowards. Jaden clenched his fists so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. He could ruin Carter. Right here, right now. He could expose him for the fraud he was, for the arrogant, insecure man hiding behind a suit and a title. For a moment, it looked like Jaden might say something. But instead, he simply smirked. A slow, knowing smirk. A smirk that sent an uneasy shiver down Mr. Carter's spine. Because that smirk didn't say defeat. It said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Then, without a word, Jaden turned and walked out. That was the last time anyone in that office saw him as just an intern. If you are enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe for more. The city skyline stretched beyond the glass windows of Mr. Carter's luxurious penthouse office. The lights of the skyscrapers twinkled in the dark, but he barely noticed. He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the expensive whiskey in his glass, the amber liquid catching the glow of the desk lamp. He had won. That intern, Jaden, had been nothing more than a pest, someone who didn't belong. Mr. Carter felt a rush of satisfaction as he remembered the way the kid's face froze when he ripped up that report. Priceless. Carter chuckled to himself, taking another slow sip. Then, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. Blocked number. His smirk didn't fade. He had received hundreds of calls from desperate employees begging for a second chance. He never called back. He answered lazily. "This is Carter." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice colder than ice. "You fired my son." The whiskey glass slipped from his fingers, crashing onto the polished floor, shards scattering in all directions. His throat went dry. His stomach twisted. He knew that voice. Mr. Lancaster, CEO of the entire corporation. The man who controlled billions. The man who had built empires and destroyed rivals without a second thought. Carter's hands clenched the edge of his desk. This can't be happening. He forced himself to speak, but his voice came out weak. "Yes, sir. I'll see you in my office, 8 a.m. sharp." Then, click. The call ended. Carter stared at the black screen, his fingers frozen over the phone. His heart pounded like a war drum in his chest. This wasn't just trouble. This was the end. A cold sweat broke out on Carter's forehead. His mind raced. Jaden is Lancaster's son. How? How did he not know? He felt sick. Jaden had been right under his nose, working as an intern, acting like an ordinary employee. No connections, no special treatment. And he had fired him like trash. Carter shot up from his chair, pacing the room, his breaths coming fast. This wasn't just about losing his job. No, this was bigger. Mr. Lancaster wasn't just powerful. He was ruthless. The man had built entire industries, crushed competition, and erased careers with a single phone call. And now he was coming for Carter. Carter grabbed his phone and dialed his lawyer. Ring, ring, ring. No answer. He tried again. Voicemail. He slammed the phone onto his desk, his breathing ragged. He needed a plan. Maybe he could fix this. Maybe if he apologized, if he convinced Lancaster that it was a misunderstanding, he could get out of this alive. He grabbed his laptop and frantically searched for flights. But then, another call. His eyes darted to the phone. Another blocked number. His blood ran cold. With shaking fingers, he answered. Hello. A long pause. Then a single sentence. You can't run. The line went dead. Carter dropped the phone. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. His fingers dug into his hair as he sank into his chair. Tomorrow morning, he would face the most powerful man in the country. And nothing could save him now. The next morning, Mr. Carter walked into the CEO's office. No, the lion's den. The room was massive, its walls lined with towering bookshelves and glass panels that overlooked the city. The carpet beneath his feet was thick, but it did nothing to soften the weight in his chest. His throat was dry, his hands clammy. At the far end of the room, Mr. Lancaster sat behind his giant obsidian desk. He was dressed in a sleek black suit, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Jaden stood tall. His face was calm, controlled, dangerous. Carter's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a sentencing. Mr. Lancaster didn't tell him to sit, didn't offer him a drink, didn't even blink. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin, and asked in a voice cold as steel, "Do you know why my son never told you his last name?" The question hit like a gunshot. Carter's jaw clenched. He could barely find his voice. His legs felt weak. "And no, sir." Mr. Lancaster exhaled slowly, his gaze razor sharp. "I wanted him to start from the bottom," he said. His voice carried no emotion, no warmth. To see who would treat him fairly based on his work. He tilted his head slightly, a predator observing its prey. "And you. His eyes darkened. Failed. The room plunged into silence. Carter's pulse pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. The weight of that single word, failed, slammed into him with a force that nearly stole the air from his lungs. "Yes, sir, I made a mistake," he stammered, his hands twitching. "Let me fix it." "Fix it?" Mr. Lancaster chuckled. A slow, terrifying sound. A sound that sent ice crawling up Carter's spine. Then, without breaking eye contact, he pressed a button on his desk. The office doors swung open. Carter turned toward the doors, expecting security. 2 guards stepped inside. But behind them, 4 men in black suits. Not company security. Federal agents. Carter's stomach dropped. "Do you what's going on?" His voice cracked, his hands clenching the edge of his jacket. Mr. Lancaster leaned forward slightly, his piercing eyes locked onto Carter like a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. "Your crimes finally caught up to you." Carter's entire body went numb. Crimes. This couldn't be happening. This was just a meeting. A warning. A suspension, maybe. Not this. Carter turned desperately to Jaden, pleading. You did this." Jaden tilted his head, considering. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Tapped the screen. A recording played. Mr. Carter's own voice. "I don't care if the kid has good ideas. He'll never make it here. Not with his kind." A sharp gas rippled through the room. The guards tensed. The agents exchanged knowing glances. Carter's body went stiff. His breathing turned shallow. But Jaden wasn't done. He swiped again. Another recording. Carter instantly recognized his own voice. This time, it was worse. "They'll never catch me. The offshore accounts are untraceable. The numbers are cleaned. Tax-free. Untouchable." Carter's knees buckled. His head spun. His vision blurred. No. His world was crumbling, collapsing around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. This is illegal." He sputtered, his face twisting with desperation. "You hacked me." Jaden smirked. A slow, knowing smirk. "No." His voice was smooth, unbothered. "I just paid attention." The lead agent stepped forward. "Mr. Carter," he said, pulling out a pair of gleaming silver handcuffs, "you are under arrest for fraud, tax evasion, and corporate corruption." Click. The cold metal locked around his wrists. Carter thrashed as they yanked his arms behind his back. "No. Wait. Please." His screams echoed down the hallway, reaching the ears of every single employee he had once terrorized. The same employees who now watched with smirks and hushed whispers. The king had fallen, and there was no coming back. As soon as Mr. Carter was dragged away, silence filled the massive office. For the first time since stepping into this room, Jaden exhaled. The weight, the months of frustration, the quiet struggle, the humiliation of being dismissed like he was nothing, was finally gone. He turned to his father, his expression unreadable. "Is that all?" Jaden asked, his voice steady. Mr. Lancaster didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his towering leather chair, his piercing gaze locked onto his son. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, a slow, proud smile crept across his face. "No," he said at last. "Now we rebuild." He reached for a folder on his desk, the leather cover smooth and crisp. With a measured movement, he slid it across the polished surface. Jaden hesitated for a second before picking it up. He flipped it open, and his breath hitched. One bold title stood out at the top of the document. Vice President. Jaden blinked. Once. Twice. He looked up at his father. "You're serious?" Mr. Lancaster nodded. "You earned it." The words hit differently. Jaden had always worked for everything he had. His grades, his skills, his reputation. Unlike Carter, He never relied on shortcuts or stepping on others to climb the ladder. And yet, for the first time, he wondered, was this a reward or a test? Just like that, Jaden asked. His fingers tightened around the folder. Mr. Lancaster smirked, the way a chess master does after checkmate. Nothing is just like that, son, he said. You played your part perfectly. Jaden frowned. My part? His father leaned forward. You knew Carter was corrupt long before today, didn't you? Jaden didn't answer right away. He had suspected, but he had never seen proof until Carter's arrogance handed it to him on a silver platter. Instead of denying it, he met his father's gaze and asked, would it have changed anything? A flicker of something. Approval, respect, flashed across Mr. Lancaster's face. No, he admitted, but it means you understand the game. Jaden exhaled, shaking his head with a soft chuckle. This is wild, he muttered, flipping through the pages. Everything was so official. His name was already printed in the documents. His seat was waiting. Mr. Lancaster watched him closely. Welcome to the real world, son. Jaden let the words sink in. Then, without another word, he looked down at the nameplate on the desk. The one that had belonged to Carter. The one that represented power, responsibility, and a future he had never expected. With careful hands, he picked it up, paused. Then, he replaced it with his own. A new era had begun. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story with unexpected twists and drama. Let us know in the comments what you think. More great stories coming soon.